Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I welcome you to the fifth week in our special series titled Celebrating Canadian-American Friendship. And as our viewers can note from our past programs that we're doing a lot of sub-areas in that comparison. We have two subtopics today, Canada and the United States sharing common challenges, and one of those challenges then is comparing the philosophies and activities of hate groups that have operated in Western Canada and in the Pacific Northwest. And we have a guest today that's highly qualified to address from a historical perspective what hate groups have done and their philosophies and how good Americans and Canadians have combated these hate groups. We welcome to the program Norman Gissel. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and he's also on the board of the Human Rights Education Institute. Norm Gissel is an attorney in the state of Idaho and was the family attorney that led the case along with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Morris Dees that bankrupted the Aryan Nations, and the jury awarded $6.3 million. Oftentimes when the task force is asked for a speaker, if it has to do with this issue and historical perspective, Mr. Gissel is called into action. Norm, thank you for being here, and we appreciate your time, and this is a very special week at North Idaho College.
Well, thank you for having me once again, Tony. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And I'm very pleased to have our regular panelists. First of all, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Norm, it's a pleasure to have you here again. We've met before, and we've talked about a good number of issues. Today we're talking about hate groups, and so to set the foundation for our viewers, would you define what hate groups are? Who are they? Where are they located? And some idea about the numbers involved in hate groups.
Right. Who are they? Initially, that was your initial question.
Yes.
Who are they?
How do you define them?
How do you define them? It is hard to define the word hate because it manifests itself in so many different ways, and it seems to modify itself and redefine itself as it cascades down through history. But for us in the Northwest, we've been exposed to hate groups continuously now for well over 30 years, and they manifest themselves as racial hate groups, not religious hate groups so much, but racial hate groups. There's anti-Semitic and anti-black feelings among the North Idaho hate groups. How they get that way is a historical quest that we can certainly go into later on in the program. The predominant hate group in the Northwest is not the Klan, as most people would assume, because the Klan is better known. It's the Aryan Nations, and their singular devotion to racial hatred has been their central theme since their origins, at least since they moved from Southern California to North Idaho in the early 70s. Then there are, on the Canadian theme as well, there are Aryan Nation cells in Western Canada as well, and how they got here, if that was the third part of your question.
Yes.
They got here, and it's a long and fascinating story why they chose this area. And you have to go almost through the whole thing, and I'll go through it briefly, and we can revisit it if you like. What happened was that the Civil Rights Acts and activities of the late 1950s and early 1960s resulted in a profound change in American culture. America after the King years, as they're appropriately called, was a much less racist society than it was before the King years. And there were avenues and opportunities for African Americans that were simply unavailable a few years before then. they got to vote in large numbers in the South, where they had been denied the right to vote through a variety of rules and regulations in the South. They began running for political office, and to no surprise to anybody, they started becoming elected to political office. The black middle class started to grow and at a very rapid rate. So these were all cultural changes inside the United States. The Klan, who was the chief opponent of this process, was deeply disillusioned that the South would begin in earnest to integrate, and the South would begin in earnest to heal its historic wounds over racial matters. And they looked to where they could move. It was a variety of them. They simply wanted to move and try a new place. Now, in the 20s and 30s in America, they had tried big cities in the North, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Chicago, various places like that, and had met with very little success. They had been in the South for decades, and they were confronted by their own futility in the South because, as I indicated, there was this huge transmission and change in the cultural society of the South particularly, and that their integration was flowing everywhere in the South. So that left really one place, and that was rural North America. And there was this, actually, you could almost say, a racial diaspora. The racists were moving and looking for new venues and new places to reestablish their belief systems. And there was, if you look at the demographics from Ellensburg, Washington, all the way through almost to the coast of New Jersey, setting aside the large cities such as Chicago and Detroit and places like that, in the rural populated states of the North America, it's also essentially white. And they believed in some cooked up Darwinian idea that this was essentially a white place because of our inherent racism, and they moved to the northlands of America in search of this innate racism that we were alleged to have had. And for us here in the Northwest, the place they initially chose, of course, lamentably for us, but that's where they chose. They chose Kootenai County.
All righty, here we go. Welcome to the show, and I want to applaud you for what you have done in human rights. You have been a wonderful champion, and we are so lucky to have you in our community, Norm. What I wanted to go into was, what would you say would be the current status of some of those groups? I know that those groups had a really strong hold here in North Idaho especially, but what would you tell our viewers about the current status of some of those hate groups in the Pacific Northwest today?
I believe, and I've thought about this, the answer to that question at some length in the last few years, and my belief is that the establishment of racist institutions like the Aryan nations in the Northwest has been shattered, and irretrievably shattered, at least for the next 20 years. You will not see a resurrection of anything similar to the Nazis in the Northwest. And the reason is not because of the lawsuit. People would say that. The reason is because of their final understanding that we in the Northwest will not become part of their system, that we're not inherently racist, that we're not inherently un-American, that we do not hate as a regular part of our thought diet every day, day in and day out, like they do. And they understand that now, and they understand that from a variety of different ways, and that lesson has been taught to them. And they are politicians. They seek political agenda. We've called them cultural politicians, but they're politicians, just like regular politicians. And that means they need political support from the people that they're trying to influence. And they have none. They have received none. And that has been a shattering experience for them. I can add to that the big part of the Aryan nations had moved to Pennsylvania, to a rural white county in upstate Pennsylvania, and then they left there. So they're still on the move. And the last time they were echoing around somewhere in upstate New York, but I don't, they don't have any place to. They don't have a homeland. Okay. The Nazis do not have a homeland in the Northwest, and they're not going to have one.
Just a footnote, then I want to ask you a question before you can give some advice with your expertise. But certainly, what you said has great value, and there's a lot of ways that message has come through that the Northwest would not accept their doctrine or their activities. But certainly, there's evidence of that. You being an attorney with the jury, your great victory in the trial when 12 persons, ordinary men and women in the area, said no to them and awarded $6.3 million, or the voters of Hayden last year when they said no when Richard Butler ran for mayor, and the largest voter turnout ever in that city to say no to him. So those are pieces of evidence that they've got the message.
Right. That vote in Hayden deserves to be examined in a variety of different ways. That was a singular defeat to them. Here was a straight-up election where the Nazis had to come out to the community of Hayden, where they had lived for 30 years and had advocated and importuned and pled and cajoled for 30 years, and had people that are affiliated or shared those ideas had committed who knows how many different heinous crimes in furtherance of these Nazi beliefs, something like 100 felonies that we know about. And all that they could come up with after all of that time was, 30 votes? Out of
about 2,200 votes.
Out of 2,200 votes.
Yes.
I mean, there was that's nothing. That's statistical.
Words,
a statistical zero.
They got a handful of votes out of 2,200 votes,
yeah.
So they were resoundingly defeated. A person who can't be on the program today, but is sure on this series on sharing between Canada and the United States, he's in intelligence and undercover some with the city police in Calgary. But he indicated to me, and he's been speaking at North College, that there's activities of hate groups in Western Canada, and beautiful Western Canada is like the Pacific Northwest, much of its rural area. And so again, looking for a homeland. With your expertise and all the years that for 25 years you've said to me that one of your great passions is to combat hate and to be what you've called a Nazi fighter, to try to actually defeat the Nazis. With all that experience, what would you say to Canadians? About half of our viewers are from Canada, and these police officers and human rights activists and political leaders and religious leaders. What advice would you give to Western Canada as they also confront this issue of hate?
I'd first start off with complimenting our Canadian friends. Canada, unlike America, unlike the United States, had no significant history with slavery and the importation of people against their will as slaves or for the slave industry. So they never had this institutionalized quality of racism that we had all the way from the beginning of our country all the way to 1864. So they were way ahead of us at that time. The quality of their racism is different too, because it's derivative essentially of a lot of our racist entities like the Aryan nations and the Klan. They're essentially imitators. There is no original Canadian hate group entities that I've been able to find that have sprung up on their own sui sponte, so to speak. That it just doesn't happen up there. And the culture up there is quite a bit different than ours. In these areas, they're very much in a way they have a much healthier social contract among themselves than we in America, than we in the United States do. So they're never going to be confronted with the severity of like the Klan in the 30s that dominated politically in some states, Oregon, Indiana, and others. You're just not going to have that up there. On the other hand, if you ignore it, and if you pay it no attention, and if you treat it lightly and insignificantly, history tells us that that's the wrong thing to do. There is no historic example that anybody can point to that being silent around Nazis is a good idea. The only way to deal with Nazis, and other races for that matter, is to talk about it loudly, publicly, and often, and clearly, and to discuss it so that people are aware of it, how insidious it is, and to monitor very carefully the growth in the ranks, if there is any, and how that growth occurs and from what sources. And the Canadians, which they are doing, are very watchful of these entities, and they're doing a commendable job up there.
Just one footnote back to the panel. Kathy Palomar, who was on this program, was at this symposium. She works with the Alberta Human Rights and Citizenship Commission, and they recently did a poll in Calgary in Alberta, and 95% of the people polled said that they really support human rights and do not support this kind of activity that would be promoted by hate groups. That's very encouraging.
Yeah. Yes, it is, and that is part of this historic process that Canada lived serenely through an era that we fought through, which was the Civil War era. The English slave-holding countries in the early 1800s got rid of slavery by legislation. They simply passed laws and says, no more slavery. And everybody says, oops, okay. And that was the end of it. I mean, it was a struggle, but I mean, essentially that's what happened politically. In the United States, it was an entirely different issue. We simply went to war over the subject, and we didn't free the slaves until the Emancipation Proclamation, which I think was in 1863. And it was following the Dred Scott decision, which 1854, which was one of the worst cases that the Supreme Court of the United States has ever entered or delivered to the American people, which was it validated slavery as a matter of law in the United States, and it was horrifying law, and we simply had to get rid of it. And the end of the war, we did get rid of it because we passed the 13th, 14th Amendments.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
On a program such as this, one of the things we want to do is point out to people the dangers of certain things and movements that they might get involved in before they know they're involved in them. How do hate groups go about recruiting? And would you also include in that some comment on individualism when an area such as ours, which is very individualistic, where people value their own personal freedoms and maybe even a live and let live kind of attitude, what does that do? So let's talk about recruitment and how people can keep away from those kinds of groups.
How they recruit is interesting. They have a variety of different techniques for recruiting. The pool of the recruits for the Aryan nations was the criminals in all of the prisons and all of the jails in the United States in which they could get their written literature. And this started right after. I think that the Aryan nations concluded that they were not going to change the minds of the people of North Idaho. So rather than accept that fact, sometime in the 80s, they says if we can't change the minds of the people who live in North Idaho, will change the people who live in the North Idaho. And by bringing in all of the ex-felons into North Idaho that they could possibly bring in through talking to them and persuading them to come here, they were going to change the political and cultural forces that make North Idaho the unique and special and wonderful place that it is. And that went on and on for years and years and years, and of course they still failed, but that was an ongoing program. And that's one of the ways they recruited. That's the pool that they recruited from. But how they recruited is equally interesting. They would recruit to the anxieties of young white men mostly. And they would help them, they would enable them to understand that their concerns and their anxieties that they felt personally were not anything that they were responsible for, but were in fact because of a Jewish conspiracy or because of a preference for black Americans in the United States or some such nonsense as that. And there was one gentleman that was recruited to the Nazis, and I remember him stating that it was all of his problems. He had a drinking problem, and he had a failed marriage, and he was struggling in college, and he was going through all of these life changes at a fairly early age. And he says, as soon as I understood that it was the fault of the Jews, it was like an epiphany, and I felt better immediately. And that's precisely the moment that the Aryan Nations is looking for, and that they saw it in these people. So they would find ways to permit these people to feel victimized by forces that they couldn't see and they couldn't feel and they couldn't touch, and that these were all conspiratorial things that were happening to them. And then at the same time, as they permitted them to feel victimized about American culture, then they also said, and that we are the bulwark of Western civilization, and that we are knights in shining armor fighting these amorphous, dark, and evil forces, such as the Jewish conspiracy to do whatever, ruin America or ruin whatever. And so you got a double dose. If you were a recruit to the Nazis here in North Idaho, you were permitted to feel victimized. They gave you a rationale for your victimization, and they said, you're a wonderful guy, and you're a knight, and you're a savior of Western civilization. This is heady brew for a certain type of person in America. And so that the techniques they used were essentially, as best we can determine, that was the type of recruitment process that went on.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, Norm, but I want to go into it a little bit deeper because I think it's so important. Local communities can really play an important part in whether or not these groups succeed, or whether or not they get a stronghold, or in their ability to maybe get these groups to leave. What would you say are some of the strategies that communities can use, as well as maybe tell us a little bit about a couple of examples? Like, I know north of us, Sandpoint has kind of developed a task force on human relations like we have. Yeah. What are some things that communities can do to combat this?
Well, first of all, they should have a community college nearby. So you have an intellectual pool of people to draw from, like Tony and others. Here's what you do, is you understand that it's going to be long-term, and you understand it's going to be difficult, and you understand it's going to be dangerous. You got to recruit to the issue of danger, because our experience was with Bill Wasmuth. That wasn't a bombing in his house. That was an attempt to murder him. That was an attempted assassination, and they never apologized for that. So that, fortunately, those people that perpetrated that crime back in 1986 were caught and sent to jail. So you have to understand that any community that's involved with fighting Nazis has to understand those elemental principles. But the most valuable thing that they can understand is that democracy itself gives them all of the tools that they will need to combat racism. The elemental building blocks of a democracy, such as ours, are equality, fairness, dignity of each individual, and the rule of law. Those are the building blocks of our government. Those are the building blocks of our culture and our society. And you go to elemental principles. You go to ground and fight the Nazis with the best words and the best ideas in democracy. And you argue from those points. You don't have to be programmatic. And the Nazis weren't programmatic either, essentially. They were philosophical. And you have to be philosophical, and you have to use and appropriate for your own use those great, historic, valuable, well-received words: equality, fairness, dignity, and the rule of law. And if you talk about those intelligently and persuasively and often enough and in the same venues that the Nazis are talking about evil and hatred and their anger at various racial groups, you get to win over time in America. That's the lesson that everybody has to... You stray from that and your message gets out of focus and diffuse. You got to stay on message.
Good.
And that was the gift of that, the decision-making process that we went through in the 80s, early 80s, in the middle 80s. That's what we decided. That's what we talked about, and that's what we come up with. And we've never strayed from those values and that approach.
We only have 1 minute left, but the most wonderful thing that you've done in teaching in this process is that it's all in culture. And it's unbelievable. In 1 minute, say why culture is really the determining factor.
Well, I look at culture as, I look at American-style politics, the D's and R's and the independents wrestling with one another. I regard those activities as derivative. I think that the soil of America that those politicians grow out of is culture. And I use it gets a little technical, I use the thick definition of culture, but it is the aggregate of everything that we believe and how we treat one another, not through the law so much, although law is culture written down in many ways, but it is how we act and how we behave collectively as Americans. And believe me, it's a varied culture is varied from the Bonners Ferry culture is different than ours, and it's different from Sandpoint's.
Or Canada.
And the Calgary is different from Edmonton, and the both of them are different from Spokane. And but there are these giant common similarities among us all, and those that bind us up.
On that note, we have to bring a clock.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry, the clock always wins on this program. It was great having you here, Norm Gissel. It was incredibly informative, and I know our viewers in Canada, United States, appreciate very much, and we certainly dealt with our theme of Canada and the United States, and thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll continue to be with us in this special series on celebrating Canadian-American friendship, and certainly all these programs deal with different issues and how our two countries are so special to one another. Please be with us again next week when we'll continue this process. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.